My name is Tanya Hornick, and I'm a Strategic Partnership Manager at the Australian Bureau of Statistics. My pronouns are she, her, and it is my privilege to be the facilitator of this webinar. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our session about the second phase of the 2026 Census Topic Consultation process. I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands we are collectively meeting on right across Australia. For me, I specifically want to acknowledge the Turrbal and the Yuggera peoples whose lands I am on today. I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge and welcome Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people attending today and viewing online. I'd also like to welcome our Auslan interpreters who will be interpreting throughout the session. In today's presentation, we will provide an update on the 2026 Census Topic Review. We'll spend some time talking about what we heard during Phase 1 of our consultation, discuss our current directions on topics, and advise on how you can provide feedback on the potential topics for inclusion, change, or removal. At the end, we will have a question and answer session. You can submit your questions anytime throughout the presentation via PollEV. Go to pollev.com/2026 CENSUSTC, and that URL will be on screen throughout the presentation. But right now it's time for me to hand over to Duncan Young, who will start our discussion on the 2026 Census Topic Consultation. Over to you, Duncan.
Thanks, Tanya. Thanks for starting the session today. Welcome everyone along. I'm visiting Canberra at the moment, so I'm the traditional owners of a land here of the Ngunnawal people. So I'll add my acknowledgement to their people and their continuing custodianship and contribution to the city here in Canberra. My team have planned some really great notes for me today to make sure I cover all the details, but I wanted to start by first telling you a bit about why this process is important to me and what it means to me. For just over a year ago, I was on a seminar very similar to this one as we released the 2021 census data. One little survey, a bit of data comes out. There was 14,000 news articles afterwards. Those articles were read by an accumulation of 78.2 million people. And people joked at the time, they often do, but the release of census data is like Christmas Day for statisticians and nerds across Australia. Well, if I extend that analogy further, I guess this is part of a process, is a bit like the Santa's wish list for the process of the census. But that's actually a pretty bad comparison. Santa's wish list for me, my son, if he's anything like your kids, it's a long list of ambit claims of things that he's hoping that his parents, who he's happy to keep believing will be Santa and will bring him one of these items. Whereas for this, we've had a long list, and we'll talk a bit about the list today, but it's actually a small list from a large number of people who've really deeply considered and thought through who needs that they have, their community has, Australia has, that they want to get information on. And they're all so well considered and so well thought out. And so I really want to thank people for their engagement in our phase 1 of our consultation. And what it makes it really clear to all of us at ABS is how much the census matters. We're just coming up to our 19th census. My 19th trip around the sun, I was still finding my way, and the census continues to grow and develop as it reflects Australia. The early days of a census, 1921 census, it was sort of a sad moment, but a reflection of what the country needed. We asked about orphans in Australia following the First World War. Through the middle of the last century, we have a referendum, and November census started fully capturing data on all of the people of Australia, including Australia's First Nations people. After that period, through the period of increased migration into Australia, we've expanded the collection of more and more data on our cultural and linguistic diversity in Australia, and really representing the multicultural Australia that we all feel so proud of today. Maybe surprising to some, it wasn't until this century, early this century, that we started collecting data on people's unpaid work in the home, caring for children or volunteering. And so the census continues to grow as it reflects a changing Australia and the needs of a changing Australia. So I'm really excited and feel quite privileged to have a role in this process each 5 years. So the census of population, it shows how our nation changes over time. It provides data for all levels of government, from federal down to local government, but also is used by our communities, our populations, academics, private sector organisations. And the census is unique for the ABS in that the topics of a census are set out by government. It's the only collection the ABS does, which is enshrined in our law, that the government will describe the topics for a census. And so we need to undertake a process at the ABS to provide some recommendations to government. And as I mentioned before, there's always quite a long list that we have to consider when it comes. In fact, if we took all of the great suggestions and all of the ideas that came into us through a topic consultation process, the census form would more than double in length. And we're not sure that Australians would be willing to fill out all that many questions. So we need to really weigh up and balance the cost of bringing on new content and the burden that'll put on Australians. And not just the cost of collecting data, but processing it, disseminating it. And so we need to go through a rigorous process to try and make sure the most important topics to Australians at a point in time are included as part of a census. Next census, only 1,104 sleeps away in 2026. So our topic review timeline and is represented here on the screen. We sort of work backwards when it comes to our topic review timeline. We need to have everything completed and finalised by late 2025 in order to make sure that all of our IT systems are ready and set up, but also to start printing the census forms. As you know, our census has become more and more digital, but the print run for a census is still a mammoth undertaking. Last census for forms from a census end to end would have reached all the way around the equator of the Earth. And so we do need to leave enough time at the end to get that done. So stepping back from there, we work out our times in between. We've changed our approach a bit for 2026 census to introduce a two-phase consultation process this year. And so we've done this because we really wanted to make sure that our process includes and provides the opportunity for everyone in Australia to really guide the process through phase one and then respond to what they hear in phase two. We've just started with phase two consultation, and that'll run through to the 8th of September. And there's a publication online that many of you have already seen that talks about our phase one outcomes. And these phase one outcomes we'll talk about more later in the presentation. After the second phase of consultation closes, the ABS will continue the evaluation of the topics against the assessment criteria. And in late 2023, we'll release a new shortlist of topics, a shorter list than the previous one, and a list of topics that will be considered for testing, alongside also listing the topics that aren't being progressed further in the process. We're trying to be transparent at every step in this process. But census it's quite difficult to get questions right for a census. The census needs to be filled out by every household in Australia, whether English is their first language or not, no matter what their cultural background, no matter what their education, no matter what their location in Australia is. And so we need to go to a fair bit of work to try and make sure that the questions are easy to understand, easy to complete, and something that households will fill out accurately in order to serve the need of the data that we're collecting. So we'll test these through focus groups, cognitive interviewing, and a large scale or public test. As it says, we make recommendations to the our minister on census topics in mid-2024, and the government will go through those planned changes in census. They go through both houses of parliament in order to get finalised in 2025. So I said we got a lot of feedback and submissions. In fact, we had about 800 submissions, but some of those submissions contributed to more than one data request. So when we add all of those up, there was 930 data requests we received through this process. About 260 of these came in through the consultation phase 1, but also we have heard from Australians over a long period of time since the last census about things that I'd like to see in the next census. And we really wanted to take a policy of listening to everything that comes to us, no matter where it's come from. And so there's been other reviews the ABS has done. There's been feedback from parliamentary inquiries. There's been letters to the Australian statistician, to members of parliament, other correspondence. We also considered 2021 submissions for 6 topics which we could see were a priority last census but didn't progress through to a form. So all up, you can see the representation of these grouped on the screen. You can see the 2 biggest ones there are around cultural diversity. And this was largely through a review of our religion standard that is being conducted by the ABS, which led to a number of responses. Also, a significant number, a bit more than a third of our responses are to do with a population category, which includes sex, gender, variations of sex characteristics and sexual orientation. But we'll hear more about these topics as our presentation goes on today. So what do we do with the topics when they come in? Well, we developed a set of assessment criteria that we published before the process started. And these topics are based on some guidelines from the United Nations on how countries across the globe, and about 200 nation states run censuses, how you should consider topics and content for censuses of population and housing. And in the first phase, we assessed our topics firstly against criteria 1 to 3. And so these are the ones which really try to represent how valuable or how important is this data to Australia. Is it of current national importance? Is there indeed for data at a national level, but also the power of a census is that it gives data at a local level or for small population groups? And is there likely to be a continuing need for data on the census on the topic following the census? Because one of the great powers of a census is to be able to see a change in data over time. After we finish that assessment against the first 3 criteria, we consider the 4th criterion, which is, are there other suitable alternative data sources or solutions that could meet the topic need? So if the data already exists in another source, well, maybe we'd be better off using that at source and keeping the space available in the census for another question. I now get to hand across to Georgia Chapman, our Director of Census Content, to talk to you more about the outcomes.
Thanks, Duncan. Hi all, Georgia as the Director of Census Content. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm delighted to be back to share with you some of the detail, which I'm sure a lot of you have already read. I'm going to quickly go through what our shortlisted topics were, but really what this is about is talking about what information we need to finalise our assessment to make the best possible recommendation to government. So don't feel stressed if you haven't captured everything on the slide. There will be a recording later, and it is all in our on our website. So, just as Duncan said, there were always more requests and really good requests for topics than we can accommodate. And the reason I say this is to reiterate what Duncan said, that just because something wasn't shortlisted doesn't necessarily mean that we didn't see a data need or didn't see the topic as having public value. The shortlist reflects the topics with the strongest public value based on that criteria. And we appreciate that that may be disappointing to some, but we have established this process, and we are working to make sure that we do recommend the highest public value for the broadest number of Australians. On this slide, we do have the 12 new topics shortlisted for further consideration for inclusion. As you can see, these cover a range of themes, from population themes such as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural identity to gender, or we've got information about families such as, is there shared care of children arrangements so we can understand where children are living across multiple households, to questions on households and what their energy use is, and also questions about the dwellings, because it is the census of population and housing. Dwelling occupancy status, why is a dwelling occupied or why is a dwelling not occupied, which will inform a range of government policies. We will go to the next slide because it is hard for us to really understand, is a question going to work on the census without going through a feasibility process, which is coming up. But we wanted to really reiterate that there is a lot of development, testing, and we do often find that it's really hard to ask new questions on the census that everyone in Australia can answer. So without going through the full assessment, we wanted to give you an indication of the things that we're thinking we need to really look into as we go through our phase 2 assessment. So you will see in the publication a topic flags for those new topics. And a topic could be flagged against one of 3 things. The first one is complexity across topics. And what that means is that we think this topic could, it's dependent on another topic change. So it's not just one thing in isolation, but it will mean that something else has to change, or that collecting the data on the topic may impact how someone sees another topic and responds to it. So we'll need to consider that. The second one is sensitivity. We know that we are asking questions of a number of Australians, and we do need to balance that data need versus what we ask. And so if you see that sensitivity flag, that means that under the Privacy Act, that question has been, or that topic has been classified as sensitive information. And that means we just need to be really conscious of that in our testing, in our understanding, in our engagement as we proceed through the process. The final one is previous evidence. As I said, there is a lot of work that goes into developing topics and questions, and we usually, it's best to have a starting point. Do we have a standard way of asking that question in other surveys? Have we tested something already for the census that didn't quite get through? And have we got examples that we could use to give us a starting point to conceptualize and understand what that question might look like? Really want to stress that a topic being flagged 1, 2, or 3 times doesn't mean that it's automatically out. That's a really important point. These flags are just an indication of the things we need to consider, and we have 6 criteria. Our final recommendation is a balance of all the different elements, the public value versus what it would mean to cost to collect, or how people respond to the question. So it just gives you an indication of where our focus will be over our phase 2 assessment. I don't want you to feel like you need to read this slide, digest it. It is just, in addition to the new topics, we assessed all 53 existing topics, and this is the list of them. Just to give you a sense, the list in black, they're the topics that we've assessed as having sufficient public value. We want to continue to collect them, and we're not going to change them. The ones in green, there are 16 of these. These are the topics where we received information from you, where we saw sufficient value in investigating a change. This range from reviewing the list of long-term health conditions to make sure we have the most important conditions to inform policy. It could be whether we want to add home education as an attendance at an educational institution. Or it could be, it also ranges to how we collect information on religious affiliation as we are looking to update that standard question. Some of these topics we still need more information about. Changing a topic has impacts. People use that data and they use it over time. So we don't change a topic lightly, just like we don't add a new topic lightly. We really need to understand what it would mean to the users, to people who use that data. Some of these topics, we think we have enough information to go on to understand what those implications are, and some we really don't. And I'll go through what those second lot are a bit later as I talk about the consultation, because it's really important that we hear from you to make sure that we are understanding what implications there might be if we were to change a topic. So that's the ones in green. There are also 4 topics in orange. And again, I will go through them later in much more detail. But these are the topics where, when assessing the public value, we felt that there was, the public value had changed a little bit. It was, we need a bit more information to make sure that the changes in the environment, the changes in the administrative data sources available, whether we still need to collect it on the census or whether there's other ways that we can meet that need. So we're not saying they're going to be removed. We're just saying we need a bit more information. And that gets us into the phase 2 of the consultation. As I've just shown you, there is a lot of things still under consideration. And as Duncan said, we can't take all of that through to testing. So we need to go through we need to start assessing feasibility, and we'll go through what that looks like. But also we need to hear from you to make sure we fully understand what we're looking at and what we need to consider as we proceed through the process. And this is where this seminar is really going to add, I hope, a bit of colour and movement and help you if you want to tell us something, how to make the best possible submission to help put your case forward. So there are 4 things I want you to know. The first one is we have a range of questions, but I want you to understand that assessment criteria that we're looking at. It is in the consultation hub when you go through the questionnaire, but it's those criteria 1 to 4 that we already have assessed against. We're just wanting to update that assessment with new information. So when you answer every question, just think about those criteria. Why do we need to rethink our assessment against that criteria? What is the impact? The second thing, and we said this in the phase 1 consultation, it's quality over quantity. And I can't stress that enough. One quality submission is just as good, if not better, than a number of smaller submissions or a number of people putting in the same submission. So we encourage, is point 3, we encourage collaboration. It's actually really good for us to see that a number of people have the same need or different parts of the same need and can consolidate some feedback so we understand that there is a shared perspective of the same requirement, but it's not a mass campaign to send us a lot of things. Collaboration, absolutely, but don't feel you have to do it individually. There is an opportunity for you to put down who has participated and contributed to that submission in the consultation hub. And the final point is we have listened. You've provided such an amazing amount of information, not just in the phase 1 assessment process. We've received information since. We've also, via email or via meetings, we've also, all that information that we received before the phase 1 consultation process that we considered during phase 1, that's also there as well. You don't need to tell us the same information, but if you want to tell us, we do encourage you to clarify or respond to those questions if it is in a different format. And while we aren't requesting feedback on all the topics, you can still provide us with feedback on all the shortlisted topics. We'll also be engaging with people who put submissions in during phase 1 as we go through if we need to clarify something you said. So I keep on saying we don't need information on all the topics, and this information, and we do, but there are a number we do want to hear from you about. This list is in the Consultation Hub. It's also in our publication. But we've got those 4 topics for potential removal: the number of children ever born, number of motor vehicles, unpaid domestic work, domestic activities, and the number of employees employed by owner-managers, which is in the work topics. We also have potential changes to some to the work topics that we want to understand a bit more, and also a bit around ancestry, ethnic identity, language, and religious affiliation. So why have we considered these 4 topics for removal? There's 3 that are around administrative data, and 1 that is around the fact of that we don't think we need to collect it every census. Just because they're on this list, and I feel like I'm going to be a bit of a broken record, but I think it's really important to reiterate, just because they're on this list does not mean they're getting removed. This is a genuine request for you to help inform our recommendation. So I'll go through each of these topics, but just like phase 1, the more specific you can be about the impact to you or your organisation, the more we can understand the public value. So for these topics, we'll be asking whether you use the data. We'll be asking what is the expected impact on you or your organisation if this topic was removed from the 2026 census. Now, I'm talking about it's great if you say it will impact, well, if you say it will impact program and policy development, that's useful. But if you tell us exactly what programs it impacts, the span, how many people it impacts, the geography, is it Australia-wide, is it state and territory, is it your local council? The more specific you can be, the better. It helps us build that picture across Australia of what that impact is. We also, for the 3 topics we've identified administrative data sources, I really would encourage you to look at them, because we need to understand why they aren't going to meet the need. Just to say they don't meet your needs is not going to give us that information that we really need to understand where those gaps are. So please do go look. Our publication has the links to that information. You can go look, and then you'll be able to give us a really good response as to why the census needs to still collect this information. And maybe you'll find that actually you weren't aware of that administrative data source and it is sufficient to meet the need. Number of children ever born is a little bit different. And I will go through that one first before telling you a little bit about the administrative data sources for the others. So the 2021 census collected information on the number of children ever born to each female aged 15 years and over. Prior to 2011, though, this question was asked every 10 years. And this was sufficient to meet the data needs to inform our population projections. In 2021, we considered going back to that 10-yearly cycle, but decided we wouldn't because across the world, there is a global census program every 10 years, and other countries also collect that information. So we decided to keep the topic in for 2021, but really assess whether it was needed for 2026. It will be collected in 2031. So what we need to understand for this one is why do you need the data every 5 years, and why is that 10-yearly need not sufficient? I guess for us internally, we use this data to inform our population projections, And we've assessed that we can use that, that 10-yearly data is sufficient to meet the needs. And they're the sorts of things we would like you to consider and tell us if that's not the case. We really do want to know. I want to briefly touch on a point about this question though. If we keep it in this census, or when we include it in the 2031, we are looking to redesign the question. And that is to be more inclusive of people who identify as female or who don't identify as female who may have given birth. And this is a really important piece of work that we will do, and we will do it and investigate it before the next collection piece. We will work really closely with LGBTIQ+ organisations on that redesign when we do it. For the other three topics, there is that administrative data source. So for the number of employees employed by owner-managers, we've identified that the monthly labour force survey, Jobs in Australia, which uses personal income tax data, and counts of Australian businesses' entries and exits are all available. And we just want to understand where's that gap if you still need this data. For the number of motor vehicles, we are considering removing this topic as there is administrative data available. And this includes the state and territory vehicle registrations and the Road Vehicles Australia that is released by the Bureau of Infrastructure and Transport Research Economics. And for unpaid work of domestic activities, so that this is that question around the number of hours that you do of domestic work in the week of the census. We actually run this amazing survey called the Time Use Survey, and this is going to be run every year. And this has a much more granular level of data and detail about those different domestic activities. And our initial look at who was using what data was that people were using the Time Use Survey much more than the census for their information. There is also data from the Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia survey. In terms of the topics for potential change, ancestry and ethnic identity. So we heard there's benefit in collecting for ancestries. We also heard there's benefits in collecting data on ethnic identity, either in addition or to replace ancestry. What we need to understand is, would there be any impacts of collecting or implications of collecting for ancestries for you or your organisation? And we also really need to understand what the unique use cases for collecting information on ethnic identity in addition to ancestry are. A lot of what we heard during phase one provided the same use cases, the same policies, and we want to understand, is there a difference to what you use it for? And is there enough of a case for us to consider having both questions? Now, if we did decide that ethnic identity, so which ethnicity you do identify with, was a strong case, we also really want to understand what the implications would be for you if we were to remove ancestry. On language, there's a couple of concepts. We heard that people who use, the question asks if you use a language other than English if you speak a language other than English in your home. Now, we heard feedback that at-home concept means that people who speak different languages and that's their preferred language, but have a common language of English at home, means that we don't get a full understanding of the linguistic diversity of Australia. And there's a number of needs for understanding what the main language is used in everyday context. So we want to understand what the implications are for removing the at-home context and going to main language. We also heard there would be benefits in collecting multiple languages. So we want to understand a bit more about that. And if collecting information on multiple languages was there, do you still need us to tell you what their preferred language was? And anything, we also heard feedback that proficiency in spoken English, asking us to collect it from more people. Our changes to that language question may actually address the data needs for the proficiency in spoken English question. So we haven't explicitly asked too much about that in the consultation process, but we do acknowledge that there is, we are considering what the implications would be for proficiency in spoken English based on this change. We do also religious affiliation. So we ran a consultation process on the religion standard late last year, and we also took the feedback from the phase 1 consultation, and we heard that the current wording suggests someone has a religion, and a lot of feedback that it would be nice to reframe the question to start with understanding if a person does have a religion and then ask them what that religion is. What we're thinking is a 2-part question to address that need. And we want to hear what you particularly, we know this will break the ability to analyse information over time. So I do need to, or we do need to understand, do you use the religion data and the changes over time to inform your policy development? And what would be the impacts for that if there was that break between the 2 censuses, and how we asked the question, sorry. And finally, we have work topics. So we have joblessness. So we heard there was benefits in obtaining a broader view of the potential labour force. And this is part of that labour force suite of questions. So we want to understand a bit more about what aspects would be of use to you and why. And for employment arrangements and job security, this is the status in employment questions that we currently have. We want to understand, is there any further benefit to you if we were to look at understanding if there was an employee working on a permanent, casual or fixed term basis, questions like that to understand joblessness and availability for future work. And I'll hand back to Duncan for the next slide.
Thanks, Georgia. How do we go about our assessment in phase 2? Well, phase 2 is where we really start looking at criteria 5 and 6 and start progressing the assessment further on these. And so criteria 5 is about, can data on the topic be collected efficiently? And criteria 6 is really asking ourselves, can a representative of a household, would they be willing and able to answer questions on the topic for each member of the household? And as I mentioned earlier, that's one of the, I guess, differences in how a census is done with a household form compared to some of our other surveys. And so this assessment will inform decisions on which topics proceed to testing. We haven't made a decision yet on which topics will proceed to testing, and not all of the topics that George has talked about today will be able to go forward into that testing process. Testing will include a mix of focus groups, cognitive interviews, and a large-scale test where we get members of the public in an optional kind of way, but a large group of members of the public to participate and try out changes to questions. So one of the other changes that we're considering at the moment is the use of administrative data. So this is data which already exists as potential to replace the need to ask people questions in the census. And in particular, what we're looking at is the potential for the use of administrative data on income to replace having to ask people a question in the census. So why would we consider this? Well, asking less questions in the census takes away a bit of burden for people in the household. Sometimes, particularly with a question like income, you might have to go and ask each person in the household just to confirm what their income is or look something up to work out the income. But secondly, the administrative data on income can give a bit more detail than what people give during the census process. And so we've actually done some work on this and made some data available for 2021, which shows census alongside both an income measure from taxation records, but also a main source of income. So do people get their income from a government benefit, or from savings and superannuation, or from employment income, but also the main kind of government benefit. So this gives a real chance for data users to be able to understand different cohorts in a population and how their characteristics might be different. But we've sort of separated this one out a little bit from the other topics, because we really need data users to be able to get in and have a good play and use the data in order to provide the kind of feedback on the utility and the use of this data compared to the income that we've traditionally got through the census. So in just a few weeks, we're releasing what's an experimental product called the Administrative Data Snapshot of Population and Housing. So this is a picture sort of like the census of the population of Australia, but drawn together from different administrative data. And so we're going to do a 4-month public consultation period to understand the value of this administrative data picture of Australia rather than a census picture. But through that process, we're asking for specifically feedback on the income data and whether or not it's got the utility and value that people need from a census, so that we can consider whether or not a separate census question is needed, or whether or not this data could meet the needs for 2026. I'll hand back now to Tanya.
Thank you, Duncan, and thank you, Georgia. Welcome to my virtual couch. You've given us a lot of detail, and similarly, there's been a lot of activity in Poll EV. So I think it's fair to say that there is a lot of interest in phase 2 of the 2026 census consultation. But it's not too late for everyone to submit their questions via Poll EV using the details on the screen. So with that, let's make every minute count and go to our first question, which I'm going to ask you, Georgia. What are the response options under consideration for the category of sex and the category of gender? Will the gender question be optional?
Really good question. So this the standard for sex, gender, sexual orientation, and variations of sex characteristics has been developed in close consultation with the LGBTIQ+ community. And as always, if we have a standard way of asking questions, we do start with that. Now, there are some considerations in that standard in terms of this is a household form, and it is asking, people have to answer it themselves without an interviewer. So there are different ways we can ask questions. But if these topics are shortlisted for testing, we would start with that standard question. And so for gender, the response options are man, or current response options that we would test are man or male, woman or female, non-binary. I use a different term, or prefer not to say. There are a range of response options, and you can look at our standard on the website. You can just search for standard for sex and gender, and that will pull up the full standard and how we will be starting our testing if those topics are tested.
Thanks, Georgia. There's a lot of detail there, and I might just explore one other detail with you about
Absolutely.
the gender aspect, if that's okay. So will there be an opportunity for respondents to say they don't have a gender?
It's a really it's a similar sort of answer, is that we will start with that standard question, and our first lot of testing, if this was tested, is to run what we call cognitive interviews. And that's where we would have people answering the question, and then we'll be talking to them afterwards. And if they give us feedback that indicates they want to talk about that, or think the question, they didn't understand how to answer the question, these are the sort of things that we will take into account. So certainly we will start with the standard, we test, and we continue to look at what might be the best way to ask the question. And this doesn't just go for these questions. I think that's really important. Any question that we test, or any question that we further shortlist to test, will go through that same process.
Thank you so much, Georgia, for that additional detail. And the ABS certainly does have a lot of standards beyond just sex and gender, so which include the standard question formats. So, Duncan, I'll give Georgia a little bit of a break now, and I'll invite you to answer the next question from one of our viewers, if that's okay. You talked a little bit about the process for the census content approvals, and the question is, will the Minister, who at the moment is the Honourable Dr. Andrew Lee, MP, Assistant Minister for Competition, Charities and Treasury, be making the decision just like the Assistant Treasurer did last census?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So yes, the process will be, our role in the process as the ABS is to make a recommendation to the Minister. So we'll make a recommendation to the Minister of the topics that we think should be added or removed, or if there's a significant enough change to a topic that it needs to be reflected in a regulation. The Minister then works with government to come up with a decision, and their processes, that's for the government to work through how they come to a decision on what they want to put in the regulations. The regulations then get tabled in Parliament, both houses of Parliament, and need to be considered and are disallowable in either House of Parliament. And so once they're past that, then and the ABS will be clear on what the topics are, and we will have developed the questions in parallel that will be asked to collect data on those topics, and we'll publish those out to the public in late 2025.
Thanks, Duncan. That's a very detailed response about the entire democratic process that census actually goes through. So, Georgia, I'm actually going to circle back to you now, and there is a lot of interest in sex and gender. And one of the questions we've had is, what about children? Will gender have to be reported or entered for them on the 2026 census, or censuses beyond that?
So at this stage, no decision or no has been made on this. We've just started with what is the data need. And these are the sort of things we actually need to consider in our feasibility assessment. They're the sort of things that we have to consider if we were to go to testing. And that would be the full process of, if going to testing, we would understand what we would be working really closely with the LGBTIQ community and understanding that testing of what is that balance for where we ask questions that are more sensitive in nature.
Thanks, Georgia. I just hear you echo and amplify that message about the importance of the continued engagement that you're doing with the communities, and indeed via this process of submissions as well. Now, I'm actually going to stick with the sex and gender theme because there's quite a lot of interest in that being explored further. So, Georgia, if all 4 variables of the sex and gender, variations of sex characteristics and sexual orientation standard don't make it onto the 2026 census, are you concerned that the response rate will fall or diminish?
Look, it's a really good question, and one we consider both ways. So maintaining a good response rate is actually a really critical part of our decision making for the census. And so we need to ensure a successful census, and one of those criteria, once we assess all individual criteria, we do look holistically at, will the combination of topics, or not asking a topic, but the combination of topics maintain that support for the census and give us high quality data with that good response rate and community support.
Thank you so much. We're actually going to switch to a bit of a different theme, if that's okay. And I'm going to come back to you, Duncan, so welcome back to the virtual couch. Do you think there'll ever be a time when a whole specific topic is addressed or reviewed throughout all census questions? So the example that's being given is reviewing every question and looking at how data contributes to the topic of women or disabilities. And this could then be used to potentially tweak questions for better coverage of the topic and ensure that questions that we have are useful in tracking people's experiences.
Thank you. It is a very comfortable virtual couch we're on today. It is a really interesting question, a really good question. And it can be maybe a bit the way we talk about the topics is it makes it sound like each topic's only considered in isolation. Is this topic in? Is this one up for change? Is this one out? Whereas actually there's always these lenses going across the topics. And so this comes up as a few examples. For example, if we're dealing with an organisation that provides support for the multicultural community, they obviously look right across the census and about how the census data is useful and valuable and contributes to outcomes for that community or them understanding what they need for their community. Similar for a disability advocacy organisation or a support organisation. It also comes up when we write about our census data and use our census data. So often you take this kind of cross-sectional view across the topics. If you write an article about differences for different age groups, like we had a really interesting article last time about millennials and baby boomers, and you do look across all the different topics and are they together providing a complete picture. And so you do need to apply that lens, and that definitely does come up in our consultation. And we think about the topics in terms of their relationship with other topics, not just by themselves.
Thanks, Duncan. That's really added a lot of light to that. So, Georgia, I'm going to come back to you now, and it is actually a question about the submissions. So, yep. I was just wondering if you could please clarify what you're looking at from phase 2 submissions. So, for example, if a phase 1 submission was already made and the broad topic is on the list, but perhaps not as specific as was put forward in the phase 1 submission, yep. What happens? Do people need to repeat what they've already contributed, or is there another way?
It's a really good question, and I thank whoever asked it. We received one of the pieces of work that we had to do was we received a range of submissions on the same topic. And so it was really hard to reflect all the nuances in that topic when going back out. So we do have all that information there, and it will be part of our assessment of feasibility for those shortlisted topics. If we've asked a really specific question, though, I would encourage you to think about, did your submission address that specific question, or is there further information that you can give us that will help us understand a little bit more? So it's not necessarily tell us everything, but it's just making sure that if we've come back for more information in this space, please do let us know. But the detail on the underlying detail that you have provided is still sitting there.
Great, thanks, Georgia. We just have time for probably 2 last questions if we keep the answers really brief. So minutes are critical. Yep. Well, actually, Georgia, I'm going to ask you if that's okay. No reflection on Duncan at all. So for questions that you're considering or topics you're considering removing, is there information on the reasons why it's being considered for removal?
Yeah, I did briefly touch on it, but it is there's so much more detail, including links in our publication on the website. They're also in the Consultation Hub survey for the ones for those specific questions. So do jump on, have a read, click on the links. As you get, we do also have an email address there that will be shown at the end. If you do have further clarification or you can't find something we've referenced, please do just let us know. We want to make sure you're fully informed before you provide a submission.
Thanks so much, Georgia. Now, Duncan, you talked about children, your children, early in the presentation. We're actually going to talk about some other members of the family right now. And I'm going to ask you about why pets are not included in the family question. So I'm going to let you or Georgia tackle this one. They're a major part of a majority of Australians and should be considered under the mental health, aged care and more, according to this question. Did we have many submissions on that, and what's the process, I guess, with that topic moving forward?
Yeah, no, thanks, Tanya. We might quickly tag team on this one, but yeah, certainly it is a topic that there is interest on, and yeah, whilst some people sort of think it's a bit amusing, there is actually real reasons and good reasons why pets could be collected on the census, and there'd be value in having data on pets across homes in Australia, and certainly yeah, my dog Baxter would love to be on the census form with me, but it ultimately, my understanding is that it does come down to just the relative of importance. We have to make hard choices between topics and decide which ones have the most and highest value, and pets just haven't got quite to the top of the list this time around.
Yeah, I will jump in, and now you've mentioned Baxter, Ollie and Lottie, my two fur babies at home, I'd be very remiss of me to mention them. And pets are close, fully understand, pets are close to so many of our hearts and such a part of our family, but it is that prioritization. We certainly did receive submissions, and they did give good cases, and I do want to stress that. But it is that relative priority. There are actually some other data sources available, and I acknowledge they're not as comprehensive as the census, and that's that's the truth, because the census does give such a broad and beautiful, rich data set. But we really did have to prioritize, and that's part of the process we run. It is a driven process based on assessment criteria that we need to work through.
Thank you both, Georgia and Duncan, and this has certainly been a very rich and detailed conversation around the phase 2 consultation process, and indeed the outcomes from phase 1 and the directions. So that's all we have time for today in terms of questions. If we didn't get to your question, you can still ask it. You can email us at census.content@abs.gov.au, and further information is also available on our website, www.abs.gov.au/2026 CENSUS. And you can subscribe to receive updates regarding the 2026 Census Topic Consultation process at subscribe.abs.gov.au/2026 Census. And as Georgia said, this session is being recorded and will be made available on the ABS YouTube channel next week. The ABS thanks everyone who provided feedback during phase 1 of the consultation, and for your engagement in phase 2, and for Australia's ongoing support for the census. Thank you for attending our session today.